Hello and welcome to this month's Community Webcast Plan, Prioritize, and Track the Power of CAPPM Portfolio Management. Doug Page, our good friend from Presales, is going to take us through the value that our portfolio management module brings, some tips and tricks on how to use it, what's new. We've seen a lot of new stuff happening there over the years, so if you're not familiar with it, you will learn a lot today. And it will, at the end of the show, if you have any questions, if you could type them in at the Q&A window down in the right-hand corner, we will address them and hopefully get everything squared out before the show is over. With that, I hand it over to you, Doug.
Thank you very much. And let me just get started here. So the topic of portfolio management is one that has become very, very popular with our clients in the last 6 to 12 months. And the reason for that is that the role of the PMO or the EPMO has changed drastically. The reason why that change has happened is because there are different execution models being used in organizations that weren't around 1 to 5 years ago. Specifically, we're talking about agile development. So with agile development increasing in popularity, the traditional activities that the PMO would do have, in some cases, less relevance. Things like defining methodology, coaching those methodologies, actually supplying project managers to implement those methodologies, and tracking of traditional project management metrics are not seen as being as valuable within the organization as they were. As a result, PMOs are changing, modernizing. As some of you may have seen some of our presentations around the modern PMO, they're modernizing to change the value that they deliver to the organization, which is a fantastic thing. And you see different organizations kind of moving PMOs into different areas. If you read any of the Gartner literature or have gone to any of their events, they talk about SRO, Strategy Realization Office. So a lot of what we're talking to clients about as far as the modern PMO, it's taking the PMO out of this traditional comfort area, but moving it up in the organization to a more strategic level. So that might be on the kind of back end, as Gartner refers to as a strategy realization, or it could be what we're going to talk about today, which is really the entire piece, the upfront piece around the portfolio, as well as, because our portfolio is going to include the tracking as we're doing the plan, prioritize, and track. It includes all of those concepts. And the nice thing is that everyone is still doing portfolio management, regardless of the type of execution model that's being used. It doesn't matter if it's traditional, agile, adaptive, everyone still needs to make decisions about where they're going to invest people and dollars. As well as it doesn't matter the kind of organization. Could be public sector, could be private sector, everyone still needs to make these decisions. So what we're talking about today is relevant for any type of organization. And please, as Alf had mentioned, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A, and Alf is going to manage all of those. So what we're going to talk about today is we're actually going to start with a recommendation. What should people be doing? We're going to talk about what portfolio management is in CAPPM. We're going to talk about some best practices, and then we're actually going to talk about how to use our solution to do this in some practical terms. So the recommendation is as follows. We need to capture our investment candidates in CAPPM, meaning if you want to be able to make decisions on what things you're going to invest in, you need to be able to capture those within the solution. Once those are captured, we need to properly categorize them. And someone needs to own that. That's important from the perspective of consistency to making sure that's being done properly. We need to agree to standard priorities and metrics. And my suggestion here is to keep this simple, because a lot of times as methodologists, we like to come up with prioritization models that can be complex. And I would say if they're complex, then they're overly complex. And why I would suggest that is that when you go to prioritize, a couple things are happening. One is that this is just a starting point. Someone is actually going to make a decision about whether we invest in opportunity A or opportunity B. So it doesn't have to be so detailed that it's meant to be used as a full-on recommendation what comes out of the solution. The other thing is if you go to a scorecard where there's dozens and dozens of questions, it's very hard to kind of do a root cause to say, why did project A fall above project B? There's so many detailed questions, it becomes difficult to track that. And then we're actually going to track investments against business metrics, not project metrics. Traditionally, and we're as guilty of this as anyone else, if you look at most of the metrics that PMOs are producing around projects, they're internal metrics. Were we on time? Were we on budget? They don't come back to the original reason why we actually invested in that project. It was meant to deliver a certain impact to the organization. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. And of course, we have to get a lot better at moving to more perpetual planning, because if we're only doing these decisions once a year, for most organizations, that's not really enough to be relevant from a customer or business perspective. They need to be able to make decisions sooner. So if this process is happening once a year, it just becomes a formal budgetary exercise, and it's not the real activity that's going to be used to determine where people are going to be investing dollars and time. So what does CAPPM portfolio management do? When we talk about portfolio management with customers, generally we talk about a lot of different functionality within the system. Why? Because the portfolio management is one small piece of that. When you go into portfolios from your menu within CAPPM, this is what you're looking at. You're looking at an out-of-the-box COT solution to allow you to align your investments to your corporate goals. And it's going to give us the highest return. Doesn't have to be a financial return. That's the best payback for what you're investing in. So that could be, again, public sector, private sector. It's just basically what's going to give us the best result based on the opportunities that we have in front of us. And it gives us a structured environment to create these portfolios, allow us to define the metrics, allows us to perform what-if analysis, and allows us to better make fact-based decisions. So you can picture this almost like a sandwich where the portfolio management functionality is really just this key part in the middle. What comes before that, looking at the candidates and all this, is idea management. That's not within, although customers would look at this within their portfolio process from a tool perspective, that happens before you get to portfolio management. And the tracking that happens is generally happening through our data warehouse, through our reporting, not specifically through the portfolio management functionality either. So there are best practices. So you can see there are actually multiple steps right here where we want to identify, categorize, evaluate, prioritize. We want to balance the portfolio, and then we want to do portfolio management. But because we want to simplify for today's purpose, we want to just talk about planning. Within the planning, those are the three activities that we have to do. From a prioritization perspective, we have two activities that we want to undertake. And from a tracking, we're going to talk about performance management. So we can talk about this at the high level, the plan, prioritize, and track, but we also have to understand there are specific activities from a process perspective that we're doing that a little bit more detailed, and we're going to call those out individually. So identification, as we said with our recommendation, we have to be able to do this within the solution as the starting point on making decisions on where we're going to invest. We have to know what those opportunities are, so we have to capture those. So the first thing is, generally we talk to clients, is what is the process or source of how they're doing this today? Or is this Excel? Is it sometimes for some clients it's a web-based tool that they're capturing these in. And it's also, this process has a lot of different names in a lot of different organizations. It could be candidate registration, sometimes it's demand management, sometimes it's intake management, proposal management, or even business case management. And you see this happen in many, many different ways. In some cases, it's an Excel form someone has to fill out. In some cases, it's in PowerPoint. But generally what we're doing within the solution, within CAPPM, is we're mapping to those processes, whatever exists today. If it's in Excel and you're asking the questions there, we're going to embed these directly within the solution so that we can do this properly. And the next piece is we want to categorize. So we want to be able to say things like, what's the strategic alignment, whether that's strategic alignment at the organizational level or it's alignment at the business unit level. We need to be able to do that alignment. And that's where I'm suggesting that the scorecards to capture that should be fairly basic. And I'm going to get more into kind of suggestions on that when we actually jump into CAPPM. We may want to do some risk analysis, and we want to know what's the business metrics that are going to be impacted. Then we have the prioritization. So we can look at things like financial return, risk rating, sustainability, anything that's going to be important for your organization. And also knowing that when we get into the portfolio management functionality, you have the ability to manipulate these different variables with different weightings. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And generally you would see things like this where a client has a list of strategies. So in this case, it's grow revenue. They want to optimize operations. They want to promote innovation. And then we would actually have different metrics below this that we can actually track. So what are the specific indicators within these strategies that we're going to be tracking within CAPPM? And this is an example within the tool itself where we've listed out these various strategies, and you can see on the right-hand side we're providing different weightings for these to understand the relative importance of those different strategies. And then the other part of prioritization within CAPPM is the ability to do scenario management. So we don't just have one view of a fixed prioritization for this portfolio. And the scenario actually allows you to do quite a bit. It allows you to make changes in the prioritization or ranking model, so you can have different scenarios that give different priorities to different strategies. So a good example of this is, I like to say to clients when they're doing portfolio management within CAPPM, what they're really trying to do is to offer options to executives. So they can say to executives, if you want to focus on strategy A, here is a list of projects that we believe you should fund. If you instead want to focus more on strategy B, here is a different portfolio of projects that we believe you should be funding. So it allows us to modify those ranking rules. But the scenarios also allow you to modify constraints. So you can, at the same time as you're modifying the ranking rules, you could also say, what happens if I get an extra 5 developers next year? How much more work can I deliver? Or what happens if I get additional funding or I lose funding? What is the impact on this portfolio and how much work I can deliver? The tool is very good at modeling those changes to constraints. The other thing you can do is manual re-ranking within the portfolio, and that's something that's very important that clients don't necessarily take advantage of. But the reality is that the ranking rules that you'd set up within the solution, as I said before, are really just a starting point or a suggestion to say, based on your model, this is the ranking order. But people are being paid money to make decisions about which projects should be approved and which ones shouldn't. So being able to manually re-rank the projects after the initial ranking is done is very important functionality that clients should definitely take advantage of. A good example would be information that's not captured within your ranking rules. If we had someone who was supposed to sponsor a project and they've just left the company or they've gone on sick leave, well, maybe that project needs to be de-scoped. That's not something that's necessarily captured in a prioritization model. And other functionality that clients don't take advantage of is the ability to actually modify the projects within the portfolio. So when I say we're modifying the projects, we're not going back and changing the projects themselves. So we're not changing anything that the project manager teams would see. We're just making these changes within the scenario, within the portfolio. So we can move projects earlier or later. We can actually change the cost. What happens if this project ends up costing us $200,000 more? And we can change resource demands. What happens if we've underestimated the amount of developers we need for this project and we want to increase that? You can make all of these changes within a scenario or what we call a plan within CAPPM. So there's a lot of power there to make this as real as possible. And this is just an example screen, and we're gonna jump in here live, but this is the waterline view that will show us how many projects are above this horizontal gray line, the water line. So in this case, it's telling us we can do the top 6 projects, and everything else within this portfolio is falling below the water line. It's going to show us on the right-hand side a Gantt view for this entire portfolio and when those projects are going to be executed. And then across the bottom, we have all of our constraints that we've asked to see. The ones that are green, we're still okay for that constraint. We haven't gone over our limit. And where we see red, in this case for total resource demand and for business analysts, we see we're in red, meaning that if we want to execute these top 6 projects, we're going to have an issue from a total resourcing perspective and specifically with business analysts. So portfolio balancing. When we talk about the prioritization for some clients, that prioritized list is kind of the end. It's like, okay, we've got the prioritized list, let's go and do that, and we're off to the races. But the reality is there's more to it than that. We want to make sure that we're balanced with the type of projects that we're offering, the types of benefits that they're going to deliver, different risk levels, how many projects are really meant to transform the organization versus those that are making incremental changes to what we're doing. You want to make sure there's good balance looking at these other variables against your investments. So it's not just about saying this is number 1, this is number 2. You might rank those and then say all these projects are basically trying to do the same type of thing. We don't have enough transformational projects, or maybe we have too many of those. So it's important to look at balancing from whatever perspective makes sense for your organization on what that balance might mean. And we'll look at some examples of these when we get into the solution. And then there are just some examples. So if you just look in the top left here, you'll see there's a pie chart that basically shows us for a single portfolio scenario, how much money are we spending on different goals or strategies. And we can see, okay, there seems to be a fairly nice mix across the board here. But if you look at this light purple, maintain the business, that's 3% of our spend. So that might be way too low given, what standards are for keep the lights on an organization. Perhaps our prioritization model did not put enough emphasis on activities to kind of keep the lights on. We basically, as most prioritization models do, they focus on things that are going to be really interesting in the organization. They're going to change the organization. They're going to deliver new revenue. They don't necessarily give a lot of weight or a lot of importance to things that might seem quite boring but are actually quite important to the organization, these kind of keep the lights on activities. So we see this a lot when you do your prioritization model and you come to a balancing view like this and you realize we need to go and manually do some re-ranking to bring in some other activities that are going to help us keep the lights on and make sure that we're kind of protecting the base. And then performance management. This is, this piece that Gartner talks about a little bit with the Strategy Realization Office. So there is certainly an element to performance measurement and how our project's running. And there's a lot of interesting development in these areas and how we do project tracking across different types of projects. It's a good challenge, but an interesting one for PMOs in this day and age. But specifically to portfolio management, we're going to focus a little bit more on the second bullet point here, which is benefits realization. And when we talk, this is something that clients have been very interested in the last few years, but what we see is maybe a view that's too simplistic because we're trying to track benefits realization at the individual project level. And in some cases, that works in some organizations, but in most organizations, it's not practical to just look at project level benefits. What we may want to be doing is looking at organizational benefits and how we're actually moving metrics that are related to strategies rather than projects. And that might not make sense yet, but I'm going to show you all this in the solution, and it will be clear by the time we finish the session. So just a few visuals that help kind of paint the picture of what's happening within the portfolio. So this is a Power BI view that's basically what's going on. What do our portfolios look like? So you can see across the top here, we've got the number of investments, the total cost divided by capital and OPEX, total benefits. Then we have the total high priority risks and the number of late projects. We've got cost by goals and hours by goals, so where are we spending our money and our dollars across the organization. We've got the list of all of our portfolios and then the investments below here. And these are actually interactive where you can click on the different portfolios and update all the metrics for these. So these are really nice kind of what do these portfolios look like. And as far as typical tracking goes, there's an out-of-the-box report. Some of you may be familiar with it, which is KPIs by project type. When we talk about how our project's performing, that kind of first bullet point, this is a good one. It allows us to look at all these projects by project type, one of the out-of-the-box fields, and gives us a good listing. We can see how we're doing overall status, how we're doing from schedule, alignment, risk. We may want to look at things like this. As I said, in a lot of organizations, individual project benefit tracking may not be practical, but in some cases it is. We can see here that in the top right, this visual, this bubble chart is showing us the benefit or the planned benefit on the x-axis related to the realized benefit. Where this does work very well is in specific transformation exercises or business process improvement where individual projects are meant to have a certain deliverable or dollar savings. So in this case, this type of metric at the project level is relevant, where we can say this project planned to save us $1 million, and it either saved us 1.5, maybe bang on $1 million, or it only saved us $500,000. And this type of visual is going to show you exactly that information, who over and under promised based on what they delivered. One of the reports that I like out of the box that really relates to the portfolio is the Project Portfolio Summary Report. And this is a multi-page report. The first one is a summary like this, and you can actually select the grouping that you want on this report. So in this case, I've actually selected the goal field, so I can see below here how much I'm spending either by budget or plan cost across the 3 goals that I have here: cost reduction, growing the business, or maintaining the business. The top 2 pie charts are showing me the % of budget, again, across the different project types, and on the top right on the work status. And this report continues on as long as it needs to with all the projects by the goal that they're aligned to. And this is nice because you'll see the metrics that are included here are things that work across the organization regardless of the execution type. So there's nothing here that's specific to waterfall. It could encompass adaptive and agile project management as well. With that, I'm going to jump into the solution, and we're just going to walk through a little bit of the setup and the types of things that we would want to do. So I'm going to start with a project here. You may start with an idea. We have certain clients where the intake is actually against an idea, and there are other clients where the intake or the original idea concept comes against a project. There's no right or wrong answer there. There are some solution considerations. Whereas if you want to start with a template to say as soon as something gets created, we want to associate that with a template and have estimates that come out of that, then you're probably going to want to start with a project because those templates exist against projects and not ideas. But that's something that you can discuss a little bit further with your services team, whether that be CA or a partner. They can give you good recommendations on the best way for you to capture that intake. Regardless of whether we're capturing this against an idea or a project to start with, that categorization that we talked about. So the out-of-the-box field, the goal, we want to populate this with what are the goals that are available to us. This is a field that's available through a lot of the reporting, as I just showed. It's going to both be showed for aggregation within the portfolio, as well as those out-of-the-box reports are going to aggregate this. So it's important to use that field rather than just going and creating your own field that's supposed to be capturing the same information. The other categorization fields that are important are the portfolio category 1 through 4 fields. They're out-of-the-box fields that you can populate the lookups that are associated with these. Those fields as well are available in a lot of the out-of-the-box reports. So I recommend to clients to use those to do their portfolio categorization. So for instance, you might say, is this project, running the business versus changing the business. So any type of categorization that you would have for that, I suggest using these fields. They're available in the out-of-the-box reports, which is going to be very helpful for you. And then as far as capturing the strategy itself, there are a lot of different ways to do this, from very simple to more sophisticated, but I did suggest that we keep this fairly high level. So one of my recommendations to clients is capture it as aligned to strategy. And what I mean by that is if you have 5 strategies for your organization, then you should be able to say for each project or each potential project how well it aligns to each of those strategies. So if someone says, let's just say, for example, of those 5 strategies, the first one was to grow revenue and the second one was to improve customer service. If I have a new opportunity, I should be able to say, how well is this going to increase revenue? How well is this going to increase customer satisfaction? It may not align at all with some of those, but it's important to be able to have the scoring at that level so that when we get to the portfolio, we can then use the different strategies as levers to say what strategies are we trying to execute. I mean, what's the relative importance of these different strategies to our executives today? This might lead back to another question. When you see this goal, how do we then tie this to one? You can think about this goal as really the primary goal, because it's true that a project can impact more than one strategy, but there always should be one primary one that this is going to be associated to. In the out-of-the-box reporting, we're going to aggregate the cost, the effort from this initiative to that goal or to that primary goal. And then when we get into the portfolios, that's where I am now. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the setup of the portfolio. It's actually very, very easy to set up portfolios within CAPPM. And it's something that I talk to clients a lot about who aren't using that functionality. Get it set up, even if it's in your dev environment, and start playing around with it, because you'll see how easy it is to use, how easy it is to set up. Really, really quite simple. So let's start back to the Properties tab and just talk about some of the key fields that you'll be filling in that are going to impact the way that you view information. So when you create a portfolio, you're going to be setting up dates for that portfolio. Those dates are very, very important within our portfolio management functionality, because if you have, let's say, a fiscal year, you're going to want to plan for that year. You've got a specific budget for that year. You want to compare apples to apples. So what these dates will do is, if you have a project that starts before that fiscal year, or it finishes after that fiscal year, or you may have a multi-year project that starts before the fiscal year and then goes beyond into subsequent fiscal years, these dates will actually chop those project costs and resource demand, so we're only comparing the budget or the cost for that portfolio period with the budget that we have. So you're not misaligning your constraints. So that's very important. The other piece that I'll just show up here within the settings, you have a dashboard view. So you could have different views that will give you different tabs within this portfolio and give you different views. So that's important to make sure you're selecting the relevant view for the tabs and the views that you want for this portfolio that you're setting up. From there, we're going to go to the Contents Editor. This is where you tell CAPPM, these are the investments that belong in this portfolio. And those portfolios, at least at a minimum, should be aligned to funding buckets, because that's where the money is, so you have to align to those. Now, the nice thing about our solution is we don't limit you to having a single investment in a single portfolio. That investment, a single investment, can exist in multiple portfolios, which is nice because you may want other lenses into the organization. And you meaning you might have someone who's doing, let's say, I want to see all the compliance projects across the organization. They can simply set up a portfolio to do that, even though that's not specifically aligned with the funding envelopes that are funding buckets that are there. The other reason why this is very, very practical is a lot of organizations have to do portfolio management at different levels of the organization. So you may do it within a funding envelope. A lot of clients, they have individual business units have their own funding, but you need to bring that after to a more macro level where you're kind of got shared resources from an IT perspective, for instance, that have to deliver for multiple business units. So they're kind of, you're looking at individual prioritizations within the business units on what they can fund, and then you bring that up to a macro portfolio to say, okay, based on what each individual business unit wants to fund, are we able to execute all that given our limited resources? So having that flexibility is very nice. On this page, the first part is one, selecting the type of investments. So for the most part, we've been talking about project portfolios today, which could also include ideas that are leading to projects. You can do portfolio management against any type of investment within CAPPM. So it could be an application portfolio, could be a product portfolio, and we have a lot of clients who are doing application portfolio management, but that's another topic that's at least another hour. So we're not really focusing on that today. We're really talking about a traditional project portfolio. And I really like suggesting to clients to use these rules to auto-populate your portfolio, because if someone creates a new proposal, you don't want to have to somehow know that that's in the solution and going at it. You can add individual investments. The functionality is there to do that, but it's really nice just to be able to create rules. It says, for instance, if this project is tagged to business unit 1 and it's active, it's automatically going to be in that portfolio. So if they create 5 new proposals and they also have one that closed out is no longer active, the 5 new one gets added, the other one comes out. And you can schedule these synchronizations, but you can also just run this manually when you come back into the portfolio. So this setup is very important, but also very, very easy. And once you set those rules, you're going to get a list of investments that match the criteria that you set. Let's go into the targets then. This is where you're going to set up to say, what are my constraints? What are my budget amounts? That's fairly easy. Someone's going to provide you with that. And then what are my resource constraints below? When it comes to populating the resource constraints, you can do this manually and just go in and put in amounts. You know, for this portfolio, this is the amount that I want to provide them. Or what's nice is you can also populate the capacity, meaning you can say, I already tracked my resources by role within CAPPM. Why not use that information to populate the capacity? So if you have the information in there, then you can certainly do that. And you can actually scale it. So you can say, it's this plus in this scenario, I want that to be 20%, for instance. And that's going to bring us to a waterline view. This is the one we saw the screenshot of. That's going to give us the list of investments. The prioritization is there. This is the ranking. And if I just click on this down arrow, it's going to show me the option. This is where I define my ranking rules. So this is where you would come in and put in whatever variables. If it's those 5 strategies with different rankings, this is where you would put them in. And then you can switch between scenarios or plan here. So this might be scenario where we're focused more on strategy A versus another one which is focused more on strategy B. And you'll see the re-ranking of those projects, which is very, very helpful. I mentioned a little bit before about some of the things we can change within a scenario. You can move a project. You could move a project by actually changing the start and end date, or you can take a project and actually drag and drop it to see the impact. And when you see when I move this project, it's actually moving. In this case, I've asked the solution to aggregate on total resource demand. So I can see by period where I'm under and over from a resource perspective. So I can move projects around to actually see when should I be sequencing these projects so that not only I can see how much can I get done during this period, but when should those happen. It's a classic thing that we see that everyone kind of assumes when they get funding, they somehow in their head are starting, you know, as soon as budget becomes available. But not everything can start on the first day of the fiscal. And then as I said below, it's going to show me all of my constraints with where I'm green, meaning I've still got that constraint left over. I haven't gone over, versus here I can see for business analysts I've gone over. And if you look at the details here with all this constraints, it will show me in red shading when I've actually gone over. So in this case, this red shading starts for business analysts with the 5th project. So I can see after I committed beyond the 4th project, I'm actually short a business analyst, and it will show me exactly how many hours or FTEs I need to go and get to be able to deliver that. So a couple other views here, and then we're going to wrap up and open up Q&A. You can have a scorecard, which is a bubble chart for the projects within here to be able to see what's the business alignment for each of these projects versus the business, the finish date, sorry. I can also do my analysis. This is another way to do that balancing, to be able to say, I've got my prioritization. Everything looks good within the waterline view, but at the end, that's not where the analysis ends. We need to come in here and say, what's the mix of projects that I have, and am I happy with this mix, or do I need to go back to the waterline view and do some analysis? And then, of course, you've got your detailed resource, our capacity tab, and our financial tab. And as I said, one of the things that clients don't use very much is the ability to come into a project and actually say, I want to modify in this specific scenario what the demand is for different roles. And this is exactly where you would do that. Or I can come into the financials tab and not only see the detailed financial information, this is also where I could modify the capital costs, the operating costs, or even the benefit for that project for this specific scenario. And then finally, if I've done some good scenario analysis, I might want to compare those scenarios to each other. So there's a comparison tab where I can take these and say, what's a comparison between these? And this is nice because this is the one view, and I'm just going to kind of scroll down to the bottom here, that will kind of show you for different scenarios what are the winners and losers, what projects went up, what projects went down. You can see there's a check mark to show whether or not, just visually, whether it's above the waterline or not. So you can see this project here was, in our original scenario, was 11th. It was below the waterline. Now it's number 4, and it's above the waterline. So this is a really nice visual to be able to see how these different scenarios compare to each other. I'm just going to come back to our slide deck. One last slide. What's next? This is an important area for CAPPM. I encourage you to come to CA World. There's going to be some announcements about where we're going with this type of functionality within the tool, and I think it's something that clients are going to be really excited about. So Alf, with that, I'll hand it back to you to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Doug. Great overview. Appreciate that. It's been we've got a couple of questions in here. When you set up the dates in the portfolio during the creation process, can you go back and retroactively change those dates? What happens then? I can imagine.
Yes. Yes, you can modify the dates. The only thing that you really can't change is when you set up the portfolio, you have to say whether it's being set up as FTEs or hours. So you can see that this capacity unit type field is an enter once, but you can certainly modify the dates at any time. And as you do that, you'll go back to the waterline, and for projects that are, you know, where you've changed the date so that they actually impact the cost, you'll see that modify as soon as you resync that portfolio. So absolutely you can change those on the fly if you need to.
Gotcha. Then also, excuse me, related to that, when you set up these portfolios, you could create these rules, you said.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to make changes to the settings that those rules dictate, is that something you can do? Is that something the admin has to do? Is that a big chore?
So that's a good question and an important point. So everything that we're showing here is done by the end user. In this case, I mean, a generic role, we're talking about portfolio manager or someone who's using the portfolio management functionality. They're creating these content rules. They're just creating a power lookup, very easy to do. As well as what's nice about this, even in the water lines, the ability to create the ranking rules is done through this functionality. Now, the only thing that the portfolio manager is not doing is creating the fields or attributes that are being used that they can add here. So when someone says they want to add a variable, it's got to be a field that already exists. So there has to be some coordination up front to say, what are we tracking, what's important, and that's kind of coming back to the recommendation, is the decision on what information we're going to capture that's going to be available to the portfolio manager here. But once the information's in the tool, the portfolio manager has a lot of tools and control at their fingertips to determine what goes into the portfolio, as well as what variables are going to be used to do ranking.
Great. Risk scoring. There's been a lot of talk about that in the portfolio management. Is that something you can show quickly, or is that a wonder section?
No, we can talk about that. I think it's interesting. Like, you see a lot of examples where risk is used as a ranking rule. I personally don't like that because it pushes you in one direction or another, either to say we want to take on a lot of risk or we don't want a lot of risk, where generally you need a mix. So I see risk as being more of a balancing variable than a prioritization variable. Here you can see we're displaying risk, and this is an example that's kind of against what I would recommend, whereas here we've basically said risk is bad, so you have all these projects with very low risk, whereas in some cases in order for us to transform the organization, we generally, every time we do this activity, we need to look for some projects that are going to contain more risk. That's going to mean we're doing things that we've never done before with technology we've never used before. Just always saying we're not going to do those types of projects is generally not a long-term, from a strategy perspective, very good. So I like to see the capturing of risk for sure, using it more as the balancing to be able to, let's say, come into a view like this. It's a scorecard view that's going to be able to say something where we would replace business alignment with risk to say, do we have the right mix of risk within our portfolio? If everything is too risky, that's probably not good. But if everything is too low risk, we're not really moving the bar, changing the way that the organization works. So you do see that the risk is part of the color coding here, and everything's kind of low risk. That to me would be a signal that this portfolio is not balanced very well from a risk perspective.
A little bit like my stock portfolio.
Exactly.
Last question, and then we close the shop for today. All these fields that we've been watching, are they available for reporting in Jaspersoft?
So the answer should be yes. Certainly the out-of-the-box fields that we've talked about, the goal, those portfolio fields, those are automatically included in the data warehouse. Anything that you would capture specifically on your own, like around a scorecard for determining that actual score, those fields, just when you create those fields, just make sure to include them in the data warehouse as well, because you're going to want them available for reporting. So the answer should be yes. Very good.
We'll do one more, just came in there. Is the resource constraint pulled in from the capacity that's already loaded against the resources?
So the way that this works is intelligent. So it's looking at total capacity versus total demand. So it kind of ignores where people are working right now. It's just saying, let's take a simple example. We have a team of 2 people. They work 16 hours a day, 80 hours a week. It's going to just say, these are the projects that I have. What's the total requirement on those projects? Whether that requirement is still at the role level or it's already attached to a specific person. It's just going to aggregate all of that, and it's going to compare it to that 16 hours a day, and it's going to say, here's how much you can get done. So it's kind of total capacity versus total demand on either side. It kind of ignores, in today's world, whether or not people are over-allocated or not, because that's not really relevant in this. It's a very relevant discussion, but not specifically relevant to the portfolio discussion. There are other views that are used within the tool that help us understand where people are under or overutilized. Because, of course, you know, what tends to happen in organizations is there are certain people that are kind of the go-to people that people want to work with. Those people are, you know, over-allocated. We have other people that might be under-allocated. At the portfolio level, we really just want to understand, do we have the capacity to get this work done? It's a different process to say, how are we going to allocate that work to different individuals or different teams? And maybe the other thing I'll just mention is, you know, and again, this is something where you really should work with your services partner, whether that's CA or a CA partner, on the best way to implement some of this, because there are a lot of options. When you look at tracking strategy, a lot of times we just look at this as simple fields on the ID or on the project, but you can set this up as a sub-object just like we do for status reporting. That allows you to do some very interesting things like having due dates for when these scorecards are going to get filled out. You can run workflow against them. So there's a lot of really cool examples on how that scorecarding has been set up, and I encourage you to play around with it. But before you go into production, you really want to have a chat with some people that have done this for multiple clients that can make sure you're really leveraging the tool as best as possible. And maybe just one other thing that I'll point out around the strategy piece, because I did mention before how we're seeing clients move away from a project level benefit tracking to a strategic level benefit tracking. So if we have 4 strategies here, what we're doing within the solution, and we've actually started rolling this out for a lot of clients, is to actually look at metrics at the strategy level. So our 2 metrics for voice of the customer is our brand value. We have tracking on that we do, as well as we have a customer satisfaction index. And I can see for my customer satisfaction index, I have targets. So I don't just have project level targets, I actually have strategy level targets. And this is something where as the PMO, you can offer to the organization. We are going to be, in Gartner's terminology, that strategy realization office. And what's nice about this, besides having these indicators at the strategy level, we are then, of course, mapping the projects to these strategies. So we can say, okay, if we're not doing very well in an area, do we have projects down the pipe that are going to help move that indicator, or we've already executed projects and there's nothing else coming that's going to move that? So there's some things that can really take the PMO beyond just the project level tracking and really bring it up to the strategy, and we'd be happy to talk to anyone about this in more detail if they have an interest.
Yeah, there's one more topic, and this is a topic that we're going to address at CA World. If you haven't registered for that, then please do so now. It's a great show in Las Vegas in November. And this one is specifically around Tableau. So in addition to Jaspersoft, you can use Tableau for CAPPM. How does that work in this scenario? Also, a follow-up question is, how do you connect this stuff to the OCDB?
So as long as it's in the data warehouse, you can basically track that. And as we've basically said in 15.3 for SaaS clients, they'll be able to hook up third-party tools. It could be Tableau, it could be ClickView, it could be Power BI, to be able to leverage that information. So you wouldn't be, this is more on the back end to really get the understanding out and the business intelligence. You'd still be filling out this information, doing the scorecarding within CAPPM, but it makes it very easy to get information out into third-party tools that might be used for enterprise reporting. So it's certainly connected to portfolio management quite a bit, but still doing the core analysis within CAPPM and taking some of the back-end reporting out to those solutions, which is very nice.
Excellent. Well, thank you Thank you very much for your time today, Doug. Thank you all for attending our show. We'll see you next month, hopefully, or we put on another exhibition of CAPPM. Until then, take care, be safe out there.
Thank you.